Hello, I'm Reverend Mike, and I'm here to answer your questions about religion. Today's topic, slavery. I did a video a while back about this preposterous notion that the Bible says that you should sell your daughter into slavery, something that was repeated on national television. And I got some pretty good feedback for the most part on that video, but people wanted to know about the other aspects of slavery that's described in the Bible. And so here we are. In the Bible, there are two types of servitude, two types of bondage. The first kind is the slavery we are all at least somewhat familiar with. People captured during wars or by raiding parties and sold into slavery. The horrors that these poor souls had to endure cannot be understated. They were often renamed, mistreated, tortured, raped, and their children and other family members stolen from them. And of course, thousands, if not millions, were murdered. I wish I could tell you that there are no slaves of that category in the Bible, but I can't. While slavery of this kind is not directly denounced, the many cases of protagonists being sold into slavery speaks to some of the horrors. Unfortunately, in the ancient world, slavery was a thing, and the Hebrews created laws for the ethical treatment of servants, including slaves. Even Yeshua himself, Jesus, taught to follow the laws of the land because he knew that forming a slave uprising would certainly get you killed. Because frankly, Rome was not going to change their policies. After all, just teaching common sense in religion got Yeshua crucified. So he did not speak out directly against Rome, and he did not denounce slavery. Although I can guarantee you he was against it. The fact that the Bible doesn't directly denounce slavery is the reason why it's so easy for evil people to use the Bible to support their intolerance. But you also have to remember, the Bible doesn't directly say a whole lot of things. The Bible is full of metaphor. It's full of parable. Because the ancient Hebrews believed that that was an easier, better way to teach people. Instead of just telling them everything, you make them figure it out, and it sticks in their mind better. Unfortunately, slave owners used a few verses in the Bible to justify slavery. One was from Genesis 9:18 to 27, where Ham uncovers his father Noah's nakedness, and because of this, his son Canaan is cursed to become a servant to his brothers. For the slave owners, to make it easier for people to understand, they dropped Canaan from the narrative completely and started referring to it as the curse of Ham. That's the way they explained the skin color of the Africans as some sort of curse, and why they thought it was okay to enslave them, even though the Bible never mentions a change in Ham or Canaan's appearance. And trust me, if black skin was really the result of a curse, it'd be in there. But it's not. It's ridiculous. It is an excuse to be intolerant and hateful of an entire race of human beings. And that is not what the Bible is about. The servitude of Canaan to his kin was obviously not permanent, most likely figurative, since the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were founded by the descendants of Canaan. That whole land was named after Canaan, inhabited by Canaanites. who are often used as villains in the Bible, but none of them are slaves. So even though Canaan and his descendants were supposed to be servants forever, they weren't. So to use Canaan as an excuse to enslave an entire race of humans is patently ridiculous. The second verse slave owners used was Ephesians 6, 5 through 7, where it tells servants to obey their masters. But the key word here is servant, not slave. And if you are in the service of another person, they're your boss. Yeah, you should obey what they say. The story of St. Paul returning the slave Philemon to their master was also a favorite among slave owners, despite the fact the word slave is not used. Servant. The word is servant, which can be interpreted as slave, but it can also be used to describe someone who is willingly serving you. There was even a slave Bible printed in 1807 and given to slaves in the West Indies. It was a version of the Bible with most of the Old Testament taken out. It had the story of Joseph being sold by his brothers, but conveniently left out Moses freeing the Israelites in Egypt. It was probably an attempt to get slaves to accept their imprisonment, since slaves in Haiti won their freedom in open revolt just a few years earlier. As I've said before, personally I would have preferred that somebody in the Bible directly denounce all the bad things like slavery, misogyny, and bigotry. But the writers of the times did not speak out plainly. They preferred to use stories and parables. To the ancient Hebrews, the idea of giving somebody a book and just letting them read it was not the way you taught theological ideas. You taught people directly, face to face. It never occurred to them that somebody might interpret their holy books in completely absurd ways, like slave owners trying to justify slavery. While the first kind of servitude, slavery, is unfortunately present in the Bible, the second type of servitude is far more common. The confusion comes from the fact that the word slave only appears twice in the Bible. That's right, you heard me correctly, twice. Once in each of the Testaments. Every other reference that people assume means slave is actually the word servant. This causes a lot of confusion among Christians. It doesn't help that the term bondage can mean both forced enslavement or entering into a bond or agreement to work for another person in exchange for food and shelter or to pay off a debt. I pored over every reference in the Bible to slave, soma, servant, bondservant, bondage, every variation of those words. The Hebrews used the same words to reference both slavery and servitude, probably because there was an expectation for fair treatment in both situations by their people. After all, they weren't making laws for the Philistines, they were making laws for their own people. So if anybody had a servant, they had to make sure that they were treated properly and fairly. It's only when you reach the New Testament do you find a distinction in the language between servant and slave, because the people of that time period treated servants and slaves far differently. Even though the Hebrews used the same word for servant and slave, some references to servant are clearly slavery, like the Israelites being servants to Egypt in Exodus. even though the word slave is never used to describe them. In fact, many historians believe the Israelites may have originally agreed to work for the Egyptians as a mercenary force to supplement their army, but were later disarmed and enslaved by the Egyptians. But most of the time, when the term servant is used, it is used to describe indentured servitude. This is not the same as slavery, not even close. Jacob worked for Laban so that he could marry his daughters. He was Laban's servant, but he wasn't a slave. Leviticus 25:39 says, "And if thy brother that dwelleth by thee be waxen poor and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, but as a hired servant, and as a sojourner. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee, and then he shall depart from thee." Here, the word brother can be used as kinsman or neighbor. If he becomes destitute, the passage says you can buy his debt, essentially making him an indentured servant to you, something that was not uncommon back then. But the passage continues, stating that you should not treat them as a slave, but as hired help in your household. And then that servant goes free on the next Jubilee. For those who do not know, a Jubilee year occurred once every 7 years. In that year of celebration, all debts were forgiven. So the Bible actually tells us that should you obtain an indentured servant, they go to work for you for a maximum of 7 years, and then they go free. All their debts forgiven. And of course, in Exodus 21, the Bible very clearly states that mistreated servants are to be freed instantly. All of their debts completely forgiven. This is obviously discouraging slavery and unpaid servitude, even though the passages don't directly denounce it. Many of the great characters in the Bible, like Noah and Moses, are referred to as servants of God. They may have had difficult lives, but they were far from being slaves. Anyone that claims that the Bible supports slavery must ignore the laws set down to assure that servants would be treated well, and they must twist a few passages to support the notion, just as the slave owners once did. But they also have to take out so many passages of the Bible. Ignore Moses freeing the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. Ignore the tales of Jacob working for Laban so he could marry Rachel. And they have to ignore the fact that Canaan was cursed to serve his brothers, but was never actually enslaved, going on to father an entire free nation. Not to mention the Levitical passage we've already discussed. Regretfully, the Bible never directly denounces terrible things like slavery, and that's a shame, a missed opportunity if you ask me. But it doesn't mean that the ancient Hebrews supported slavery either. What they truly supported was the idea of working for someone to pay off their debts. And it's something most of us do every day. Many people in our society say that they slave and toil at work, but they don't really mean that they're being literally beaten, raped, or murdered, or separated permanently from their family members by an employer. And most of the time, the writers of the Bible didn't mean it that way either. We work to pay off our debts, to buy the things we need, just as indentured servants did hundreds and thousands of years ago. Thank you for watching this video. Please click like or dislike. Subscribe if you want to see more. Feel free to leave a comment or ask a question below. Your questions might even become the subject of future videos. Be good to one another. We are all in this together. Be good to one another. We are all into this. Man, I can't even say my closer without tripping over my own tongue.